Christy, good morning everybody. I won't say much about the Capital Centre at the moment because that's tomorrow. We're on strict instructions, we have 10 minutes each. So I'll take a watch on. I have 5 things to say, so that's 2 minutes per thing. How's teaching, or my teaching of Shakespeare changed in the last 5 years? As Christy said, this is a sort of personal anecdotal thing. For me, the main way in which it's changed is that I've moved from one university to another, from Liverpool to Warwick. And actually the main effect of that at the moment is that I think my teaching has regressed for the simple reasons to do with space. At Warwick, I had to teach my seminar groups in a very small room, whereas at Liverpool, I was lucky enough to be able to teach them in quite a large room. That's something we're hoping to change with our new building. But it means that I am not, at the moment, able to teach students on their feet as much as I did at Liverpool. And it seems to me teaching students at least some of the time on their feet is a desirable thing to do. It seems to me the sort of traditional model of a university Shakespeare course, where typically there would be a lecture in which information, maybe a reading is imparted, and then a seminar, tutorial, or small group discussion in which a group of anywhere between half a dozen and 20, maybe fewer if you teach at an ancient university, more if you teach at a modern one. Typically, perhaps somewhere between half a dozen and 20 students sit around for an hour and talk about text. I mean, that's a sort of standard model that certainly I've kind of witnessed over 20 years or so. And it does seem to me that the problem with that is if you are on a sort of treadmill of a text per week, the level of detailed engagement is inevitably very, very limited, especially if the group size is larger. For me, the advantage of doing some teaching on your feet is that you can take a scene and really work on it in detail. The students can begin to inhabit the language and to begin to think about the process of moving from the written text to the performance. So my experience when I've taught in that way is exercise. Again, a typical model in many places I know from internal examining, external examining, is that a Shakespeare exam would consist of some element of discursive essays, but also some element where you are given a scene or a sequence, a passage, and asked to write about it in detail. And I would say that Gobbet's exercise is something that over my 25 years in the business, students have got worse and worse at. But if students have had the experience of actually animating a scene, a Gobbet, that really helps in their preparation for it. So space, group size is a really, really kind of obvious thing. But the Gobbet is a very interesting thing because, of course, for most students, their first experience of Shakespeare in the education system is a Key Stage 3, where they do Gobbets and nothing else. Although what they do with the Gobbets is, I think, very, very questionable as a way of sort of starting them out with Shakespeare. There was a wonderful parody in the Guardian Education of the sorts of question that you get at Key Stage 3, which says, Macbeth is described as a dead butcher. Write an essay about a piece of meat. There is that sense that at Key Stage 3, you do a little bit of Shakespeare and it's used as a pretext for writing about something that has nothing to do with Shakespeare. Macbeth and Banquo are friends. Write an essay about friendship. And it seems to me that model instills in students at a very early stage the idea that what Shakespeare is about is somehow extracting themes. And I always say to my students, extracting themes, it's not what it's about. Extracting teeth, you get a dentist for that. Extracting themes, that's not how we should read Shakespeare. The way that close reading of scenes should be done should be with a constant attention to both the theatrical choices implied within them and the language. This seems to me another area where, again, I sort of think there are increasing problems. That Shakespeare's language does seem to get more and more difficult for students. At the same time, I think there is a strong sort of element of hope for the future, in that I think it is now possible for students to work on Shakespeare's language in a more imaginative, creative, and often a kind of project-based way. So something that I've started doing recently is getting students to begin to do little sort of mini research projects within their course on bits of Shakespearean language, using some of the electronic databases that are now available. And it does seem to me that the whole sort of interpretation of Shakespearean language is in the process of undergoing an extraordinary revolution, because after a century, more than a century, we are escaping from what I describe as the OED loop. That is to say, the traditional way in which Shakespeare's language is explained is by an editor looking up the OED and finding the meaning of the word there. But of course, what you often find is, if you go to the OED definition derives from the usage in Shakespeare. Is a closed hermeneutic circle. Of course, the people who put together the Shakespeare editions of the early 20th century, the Arden, and also the work on the Oxford Shakespeare glossary about onions, these were the same people, the same generation who created the OED. Just as in the 18th century, there was a kind of closed circle between the work Dr. Johnson did in his dictionary and the work in the Shakespeare edition. Now, because we have electronic databases, we can understand early modern language in a much richer way, a much more polysemous way, a way that gets away from the idea that word definitions are as described in the OED. So for me, the most exciting recent resource for my teaching is the database called Early Modern English Dictionaries, which has now actually been superseded by an even better, absolutely amazing database called LEMI, Lexicons of Early Modern English, which is a database of about 100 dictionaries, bilingual dictionaries, monolingual dictionaries, hard word lists, specialist glossaries. And you punch a word into LEMI, and up comes a fantastic array of definitions and contexts for that word that really brings Shakespeare's language alive in a new way. So I find, as an exercise for students, to say to them, for next week's seminar, we're doing 12th night, I want you to take one 20-line sequence out of 12th night and find out as much as you can about the sort of reverberations and meanings of the words in that speech, using resources like LEMI. And those of us in well-endowed universities, of course, also have the early English books online, which is now a large part of it is searchable. So again, you can type in a Shakespearean word, and up can come usages of it in a whole array of 16th century English. And I think that works well for the students because it gives them a specific focus, but it also makes learning into a sort of research experience. Question of performance. I think there's been a big movement, not over 5 years, but really over 25 years, towards thinking about the roles of performance in the teaching of Shakespeare. Certainly when I was at school and college in the 1970s, Shakespeare was still very much taught out of the kind of lead-aside Wilson Knight Episodian tradition as a kind of dramatic text. All that has changed. We now all kind of teach with performance in mind. But I think students often find it very difficult to make the link between thinking about performance in their discussions and looking at videos, talking about productions, thinking about production choices, and when it comes to exams and assessment. I think a lot of us haven't yet cracked the problem of how you build that emphasis on performance into assessment. Assessment, exams especially, we tend to sort of fall back onto the old thematic or literary model. Another, I think, very recent change is that it seems to be what until recently were often regarded as illegitimate questions in the serious study of Shakespeare can now be asked. And I would put the whole area of biography as within that. Again, my experience studying and then beginning to teach in the 70s and 80s, to show the slightest interest in the biography of the author betrayed the highest vulgarity. Partly, I suppose, because I was sort of taught it in the Cambridge tradition, which sort of scorns black fantasy. But now, I think partly because there have been so many biographies of Shakespeare, and also because in the last 10 years, Shakespeare has been sort of translated into a kind of modern celebrity. I mean, obviously, the film Shakespeare in Love was crucial in that, and there's a way in which now I think Shakespeare has an altogether different status from the status he had a generation ago. He's become the sort of sole representative of the canon, indeed in some sense the sole representative of high culture, in the culture more generally. And therefore, you know, that there is a sort of huge investment of interest in the man, Shakespeare the man. That's a good thing and a bad thing. Finally, more of a sort of question for us to sort of think about through the 2 days and to come back to in the final session on the future of Shakespeare. I think in my teaching, the last few years I've increasingly been asking difficult questions of myself, like, why am I doing this? Salary check. Why am I doing this? What is the kind of the rationale of the teaching of Shakespeare? Is it a historical exercise? Is it because by studying Shakespeare we get fantastic insight into early modern culture? Is it historical? Is it to do with a theatrical tradition? Is there a sense that we study Shakespeare because he is a playwright who we can read in terms of a long theatrical tradition going back to ancient Greece forward to contemporary drama? To what extent should we be thinking about Shakespeare in terms of other dramatists, in particular his contemporary dramatists? So, again, something I'll be very interested in hearing about the survey this afternoon is to what extent is Shakespeare taught in the context of Marlowe, Middleton, Webster, Marston and others, or to what extent has he become a sort of solitary figure? Is Shakespeare taught because Shakespeare is a cultural icon, because he is the national poet? Are we teaching him because he's been a huge influence on subsequent culture, both in terms of politics, society and ethics, also in terms of literary and artistic influence? Are we teaching Shakespeare simply because he's a bloody good writer? Because if you really want to see language being stretched, the sinews of language being stretched to its uttermost, there's no better place to do it. Is it aesthetic in that sense? Or is there any vestige of the old idea of teaching Shakespeare as somehow a source of wisdom about citizenship?